All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Binding Status. My name is Daniel Mangum. I'm a maintainer on the Crossplane project and your usual host of TBS. It has been a while since we've had a show. Before the end of last year, we spent a lot of time invested in getting out the Crossplane 1.0 release, which we're super excited about now because we have now made a promise to not break anyone moving forward, which is always nice for the users and nice for us as maintainers. But now I am getting a little more time to get back to our live streams. And we have a really great guest joining us today. Andy is a developer advocate over at Dynatrace who works on the Keptn project. I've also heard that it's supposed to be pronounced Captain, depending on where you're from. But I'll let you give us more background on that. But yeah, without any further ado, I'll go ahead and hand it off to you to go ahead and introduce yourself and let folks know who you are.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for having me on the show. Yeah, as you said, my official name is Andreas, but everybody calls me Andy, so that's why I'm glad that you called me Andy. Where am I from? I'm from Austria, the center of Europe, so not to be confused with Australia. So we have shirts in our tourist stores that says no kangaroos in Austria, because some people sometimes confuse it. It's more cows than kangaroos. Fun fact that a lot of people don't know about Austria, besides being quote unquote famous for Arnold Schwarzenegger and maybe Mozart, we are also, at least in Austria, proud that the Red Bull is actually from Austria. Even though, I mean, depends on actually who you ask. If you probably ask people in Thailand, they may say they've invented it because kind of Red Bull, the guy, he made a business deal with them. But anyway, that's a different story. Yeah, you got it right, Keptn. So the pronunciation or the spelling is Keptn. It's the German phonetic of a captain. And the idea with this open source project, it's about shipping containers, serverless, whatever type of app safely into the harbor of production, and providing some automation around delivery and also operations.
Awesome. Well, that's definitely a great background, and I appreciate the Austria history as well. Just kind of so the listeners and myself as well, get a better feel of how you got to your current role. What's kind of your background?
Mhm.
What do you do on a day-to-day basis, and what kind of led you to where you are now?
Yeah. So I studied software engineering, even though I went to high school here in Austria. Finished high school in 1998, and then immediately got a job. It was just before the 2000 hype. So I started working back then. In 2001, I started with a company where I first started as a tester on a testing product, on a performance testing product. And I think this taught me a lot of lessons about software quality. Over the years, I quickly evolved into somebody that likes to talk and work with practitioners. So having myself an engineering background on a technical product, it helped me to explain these tools and these practices to folks. So I worked for that company for 8 years, and then 13 years ago, I switched to Dynatrace. So Dynatrace is in the space of performance monitoring, observability, distributed tracing, and I've been here for 13 years almost, and I don't regret a single day. And for the last 2 years, I've been actively involved in the open source project Keptn.
Awesome. Well, that's some great background, and I like the. I've seen that path for multiple folks going from like sort of a testing background to making applications more reliable, right? Because you felt that pain yourself,
Yeah.
and so yeah, I've definitely seen that, and I likewise enjoy kind of the personal interaction, right, of working with developers and making their lives easier, which is
Yeah.
one of the beautiful things about working in open source.
Exactly.
Um, so yeah, I do see there's some folks in the chat joining today. I did want to mention if you'd like to let us know where you're joining from, let us know who you are. Definitely feel free to comment there. Also ask any questions as we go along. I know I have a lot of questions I'm going to ask, but we'll make sure to loop yours in as well. I already see that Phil and Jared both joined. Phil is joining from Seattle and Jared from San Diego. So thanks for tuning in today. So as we normally do, we're going to start off with kind of an overview of the guest project. So that would be Keptn in this case. And I know, Andy, you've provided some slides here today. So I
Mhm.
wanted to go ahead and give you the opportunity to share your screen and kind of take it away on that front.
Cool. Thank you so much. Yeah, I don't want to bore people, obviously, with too many slides, but I was actually just recording a session for Scaling Continuous Delivery, a conference that will happen early February. And I thought I'll take the first couple of slides to explain a little bit what Keptn actually is, how people are using it, and especially what drove us to architect it the way it's architected. And there's also a couple of links here that you can see, but I'm sure we'll share them later on as well somehow. So what Keptn really is, it's a lot of different things for different people. I think the best way I explain it these days, and by the way, I applaud you for already reaching version 1.0. We're still at we are at 0.7.3. 0.8 is almost there, but we're looking forward to 1.0 as well. So, but what is Keptn? I really like the explanation, data-driven delivery and operations automation. So really what it is, Keptn allows you to pick a use case that you want to automate along delivery and operations automation. There's different use cases like SLO-driven quality gates, orchestrating delivery. SRE automation is all around performance automation and performance engineering, and auto remediation. Then depending on the use case, you have to bring your configuration, different configuration files like SLIs and SLOs, service level indicators, service level objectives for quality gates, workloads for performance testing, runbooks for auto remediation. And because our project is called Keptn, so it's a Nordic theme, Shipyard is the file that you use to describe your delivery process. Now the thing is with Keptn itself is an orchestrator, or I like the word choreographer even better. It choreographs processes, so it connects to the tools that actually then do a certain job, and you can pick any type of tool. So what then Keptn really does, it automates the configuration of your tools, it connects them all together, and then it provides different things in a self-service way. So you pick the use case, and then you have it available for an API, and you can then let Keptn do the work and orchestrate everything. Underneath, everything is declarative. Every configuration piece is stored in Git, also for the individual tools. Everything is centered around SLOs, so everything Keptn does is always validated if it doesn't break things by looking at your objectives, what you have for your system, and everything is based on standards. So integrating any type of tool is very easy because we are basing everything on cloud events, which is an open standard. Right, so that's kind of like what it is. Like quickly, 3 use cases of 3 people that we had recently on our user groups. You can see here different types of organizations for different types of things, but they all achieve the next level of automation with Keptn, because Keptn is either automating quality gates for Intuit, performance automation for Triscan, or delivery automation for ERT. And so you can see you really use it and connect it to the tools that you have, and then you achieve a higher level of automation. Now I want to just a couple of more slides on the architecture, and then I'll hand it back to you. But the Keptn architecture was really driven by new requirements we have seen, especially in the cloud native world when it comes to delivery and operations. I'm not sure, Daniel, how many pipelines you have written in your life, like delivery pipelines?
Too many.
Too many. Okay. Now, the biggest challenge that while all these tools are great, the biggest challenge we have seen with traditional pipelines that we use for our monolithic applications is there's no separation of concerns. It's basically a pipeline that contains everything: process, environment definition, tool, everything is hard-coded typically in there. And what we wanted to do with Keptn is we wanted to break this apart because we saw a big problem with this. So what we basically said is, if we have a process which basically a pipeline defines that is hard-coded with the tools, then let's just break it apart and break apart the process on the left with the tooling, or maybe let's call them capabilities, on the right. And then have a process orchestrator on the left and some capabilities on the right, and then let's connect them through events, which means we have a process orchestrator that runs through the process definition. It can be as this one here, or you can define your own processes. And every time when then Keptn, in this case, gets to a particular point, it says, hey, I now need to deploy container number 1 in dev with a blue-green deployment strategy. And then maybe you have one capability, one tool, maybe Helm, maybe Spinnaker, maybe a Jenkins pipeline that can do it. Then this can virtually raise the hand, take it, does the job, and then reports back the success, and then the process orchestration can go on. So in the end, what we basically did, we ripped apart a monolithic thing into its individual pieces and connected with events like we would do in normal software architecture. And the whole thing, how this looks, this is my final slide. When you install Keptn, you install it on a Kubernetes cluster itself. It's a container-based solution. So you install the control plane, which takes care of this whole left thing that I showed earlier, the orchestration of processes. If you want to use it, you define your processes, you declare them either through a Shipyard file, if you want to automate a delivery process, or also that also includes quality gates, performance test automation, and so on. Or if you want to use Keptn for operations remediation orchestration, like running orchestrating runbooks, then you can specify a remediation file. And then the nice thing is, because we decouple the process from the tooling, completely separated, you specify which tools provide which capabilities, and technically speaking, which tools are listening or subscribing to what type of events. And this is why you can put in any tool you want. You can swap tools without having to think about in which processes, in which pipelines these tools are used. And the beneficiary of all of this is the developer, or the SRE, or the performance engineer, or the ops guy that can say, here's an artifact. And then Keptn takes it and executes and orchestrates the process by sending these events. They're then being picked up by the individual tools, and they do their job. And with this, the process goes along. Right? So kind of high level, this is kind of the architecture and what drove us to do the whole thing. And yeah, I think, as I said, I don't want to bore you with too many slides. This is why I stopped sharing now. And then we can go on with the regular program.
Well, that was super helpful. I was mentioning to Andy before this that I'm not someone who has a ton of background in like SLIs and SLOs, but I do have a lot of familiarity with, running things through CI/CD pipelines and that sort of thing. And the demo that we'll show later on today, I kind of skewed towards that, right? Because that's what I'm a little more comfortable with. So it mostly goes through just deploying things. But what Andy was showing there throughout the slide deck is you can kind of have arbitrary services, what they're called, that you can plug in here. And some of them are built in, and then some of them you can extend yourself. And we'll look a little bit later about potentially what it would look like to have like a Crossplane service
Exactly.
you could plug into this. But just basing it on that event workflow is very like Kubernetes-esque, right? In that it's a level-based system, and that it communicates a state to external actors that then act on that state and then report back. And so it really fit in with the whole kind of like mindset you're in when you're in the cloud native space. So I thought y'all did a great job with that.
Thank you. Maybe one thing to add though, you're right, it was born from the cloud native side, but we see a lot of people using it to also connect, let's say, more your traditional tool stack. We have a lot of people that are calling Jenkins pipelines that still deploy apps somewhere outside of Kubernetes, because as we all would love that Kubernetes is kind of ruling the world. And I mean, it is becoming that way, but a lot of organizations still have very traditional stacks as well. And this is why we wanted to make sure we can really connect to any type of tool.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And that kind of like arbitrary plugin system really facilitates exactly what you're talking about. I do want to, as we usually do, go ahead and jump over to the documentation here. We usually go through this part just so folks can kind of have the same experience that I had when I was trying to learn a little bit about the project and preparing a demo. And hopefully, folks at home, if you're watching this, this will kind of help you get jump started on your journey to implementing this in your own environment. So we'll go ahead and jump into that. Before we do that, looks like we have another guest. Diego is joining from Verona, Italy. Thanks for being here. It's probably pretty late over there. You're probably closer to Andy's time zone, so we appreciate you tuning in.
Ciao, salute.
All right, so I'm going to jump over to the documentation here. This is where we usually start. And one of the things I really appreciate about this site is you have some very in-depth tutorials. I'll just jump over here that shows how you can go through a number of different scenarios, and you can categorize them, and it talks about integrating with different projects and that sort of thing. So we may take a look at some of those later, but if you're at home and you're just trying to get started with this, these are super helpful, and hopefully also the artifacts we have from the stream are going to be helpful as well. But the first thing you notice when you come to the quick start is, though it integrates very well with things outside of Kubernetes, Keptn itself runs in a Kubernetes cluster. So it has that familiar install experience and has a really great CLI to facilitate that for you. which we'll see later on. But you're going to have a general workflow that you see with a lot of projects. I did want to ask you, Andy, there is an integration with Istio. And I wasn't exactly sure. It's a little different from the services. I wanted to ask you kind of what role Istio plays in the Keptn architecture. If you could just talk a little bit about the decision to integrate with Istio specifically.
Yeah. So the core Keptn doesn't need Istio, but when you install Keptn, you have two options. You can just install Keptn core, or what we call the control plane, or you can run an installation that we call for optimized for continuous delivery, which basically means we also automatically install default services. Remember, Keptn services, these are the tools integrations that enable a seamless continuous delivery experience. And what they're installing by default is what we call a Helm service. So it's a service that comes with Keptn, as you can see here exactly. So the Helm service is the service that is able to take a Helm chart that you can give Keptn. And the reason why we chose to also use Istio in that case, or require Istio, because when you define your pipeline, we call it the Shipyard file, where you specify which stages you want Keptn to orchestrate for you. You can specify what type of deployment strategy you want. And you can choose between direct deployment strategy and blue-green deployment strategy right now for the Helm service. And if you chose blue-green, then the Helm service will take your initial Helm chart and will then automatically create virtual services for your primary and for your canary, or like for your blue and green. And so this is how we've implemented it. Now, if you don't want Istio, or if you have, let's say, some other, maybe you have an Argo pipeline already that can do the deployment using Argo rollouts, then you can also use this. But right now, if you install Keptn and you want to have an out-of-the-box continuous delivery experience, then Istio is required.
Awesome. That's super helpful. And yeah, I love this architecture diagram because it really shows kind of like the two different sides that you're coming at it from. And yeah, that was one of the things that made it super easy for me. I'm very familiar with using Helm, and that being bundled just with Keptn definitely made it a lot easier to get up and started. The first thing that we talk about, and we've kind of mentioned this already, is this Shipyard file that defines sort of the stages that you're going to go through in your pipeline, whether they be, actual deployments of the artifact that you're putting into an environment, or, test strategies or SLOs and that sort of thing. Could you talk about all the different things that you can configure from the Shipyard file?
Yeah. So I think you have it open here, right? That's that sample Shipyard. So what you see here is a Shipyard file basically allows you to specify your stages. And I think it would be like your delivery stages. You see here dev, hardening, and production. And additionally, in every stage, you basically specify metadata that will later on, as Keptn is orchestrating a process, this metadata will be taken by Keptn. So if you say Keptn deploy an artifact, it knows the first stage is dev. And then what Keptn says, hey, in dev, I need to do a direct deployment strategy, which means, remember my slide earlier where I had an event that says, who can deploy into dev this container and then a strategy? It basically takes that value here and says, I need somebody that can do a deployment into dev. And here's the deployment strategy that is based on the Shipyard specification. And the same is true for test strategy, right? What type of test strategy do you want? That means if once Keptn is opinionated right now with 0.7.3, this will change in 0.8. But really Keptn first says, first I need to deploy, then I need to test, and then it evaluates. The thing that is not in here in this example is one more thing you can configure right now, which is called the approval strategy. So every time Keptn evaluates a deployment after the tests are run, it basically comes up with a score, and then you can say, based on that score, do you want to automatically approve it into the next stage or manually? Exactly. And the last thing is you can also specify whether in a stage you want to enable support for automated remediation. So in case something fails, really dramatically fails, and your monitoring tool alerts you about it, then Keptn can orchestrate a remediation process.
Gotcha. So Is it basically an architecture in which those different services are subscribing to these events and they receive an event? And do they tell Keptn in that case, I can handle this event? And is that what makes Keptn kind of like wait for them to get it back? Because I'm thinking in the case of, a test strategy. So let's say it sends out an event and it says, I need functional tests done on this deployment. Um, does the service that's going to run those functional tests, does it reply back to Keptn and say, hey, I can do those. I'll let you know when I finish them. Is that kind of how it looks?
Exactly. So the way it looks, so with the current version, and again, it is January of 2021, this is 073. A service is basically only responding when it's done. It doesn't right now say that it actually started an action. This is what we are changing with 0.8. We have an alpha version out right now, and there should be an official release probably in February. So that means exactly with the next version, then every service has to say, yes, I am starting the job because I know how to do it. And also very important, the service also knows that it has the necessary additional config files to actually do the job. So for instance, for functional testing, let's say you have a Selenium service.
Mhm.
The Selenium service also needs to say, hey, do I actually have Selenium tests? Are there did the developer or the performance, the QA engineer upload Selenium tests to the repository for that stage? Because behind the scenes, Keptn also keeps a repository, Git repository, where the individual services that connect to Keptn can basically allow the end user to upload the artifacts that is needed, like test scripts, like SLIs, SLOs. Yeah.
Mhm. Awesome. So in the current iteration, can multiple services handle a single event, or is it, will it say, the first one that replies back, I completed this thing, will it move on at that point?
So the answer is yes. In the current and in the future implementation, multiple services can handle it. Now the question is, there are services that only handle an event but never send anything back. Think
Gotcha.
for instance, we have a Slack integration. So
Mhm.
for Slack, you may just use it for pushing events, right? Slack service doesn't need to send back to Keptn, I'm done. It's just like I'm consuming
Right.
an event, and if I think this is an interesting event, I send it over to the end user. The same would be with an integration with monitoring tools where we send events about the deployment to the monitoring tool. So this was kind of like fire and forget. But
Awesome.
yes, it's possible that you have we have an integration with performance testing tools like JMeter and with Litmus Chaos. So
Mhm.
both tools in this case, they want to start running at the same time, because the deployment finishes, then you kick off the test, the load test, and then you kick off the chaos experiment pretty much at the same time under load. And in this case, we are currently, I would say with the current version, it's a little hack that we have kind of specified only the load testing tool sends the finished event and not the chaos. But in 0.8, this will then be better because every service will send a start event, and then Keptn is waiting for the stop events for every service that said, I've started a job.
Awesome. Yeah, I could definitely see how that would be super useful. In preparation for this stream today, we talked a little bit about potentially having Crossplane in this pipeline, and we'll show kind of like using Crossplane later on in the demo. But I think there's opportunity for probably even tighter integration, because we talked about potentially having Crossplane spin up these environments to do the testing in. Which obviously Crossplane can, provision any infrastructure. So that could be an EC2 instance, or that could be a Kubernetes cluster on some service, and that could be really valuable, right? To have kind of like on-demand environments for this
Exactly.
functional testing or performance testing to run in.
Exactly, and I think this is also how we kind of started our conversation, right, a couple of weeks ago, because
Hmm.
we see with this architecture, with the event-driven architecture, you provide an event-driven self-service. You say, now I want to have a performance test, and maybe
Right.
the next one in a week. I don't want to keep the environment up and running all the time, but I want the self-service that Keptn provides to automatically spin up the environment, does the job, and then throw it away. And this is where I think we need to work together and get this to the end user.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was already thinking, I didn't have quite enough time, but I was wanting to see if we could put together a Crossplane service to integrate with this, but that might have to be the next stream. Um, So looking on at a few other things, I do want to, since you have the background of being at Dynatrace for quite a while, and Dynatrace is kind of the company behind Keptn, or the starters of the project.
Mhm.
Could you talk a little bit about, kind of like the philosophy of SLIs and SLOs, and how monitoring tools kind of play into that? Because I think a lot of folks who consume this show, they're familiar with Kubernetes, they're familiar with deploying their services to it and running things. Could you talk a little bit about how service level objectives and,
Mhm.
that sort of thing play into successfully having a service that remains available?
Yeah. So first of all, I don't want to get credit for SLIs and SLOs. I think it was really made popular by Google and their SRE, best practice, yet another acronym, so site reliability engineering.
Hmm.
But basically, it's a very simple concept, and anybody who has ever done anything on monitoring will see the parallels. But an SLI, a so-called service level indicator, is something you can measure, a metric, something like, let's say, response time, failure rate, memory consumption, bytes sent over the network. So it's an SLI, something, an indicator. And then you have an SLO. This is basically objective, where you say, what do you expect a certain metric to be if you are evaluating it over a certain period of time? That period of time could be a month in a production environment, where you're measuring what's our failure rate over the period of a month, and are we meeting our expectations to our end users? It could also be, though, what are the number of database calls that were made in the last 10 minutes when I ran a load test? And how did the number of database calls that my app executed during the load test compare to the previous build, where we also ran a test and also measured the number of database calls for the same test? Did the number of database calls, for instance, increase by 10%, 50%? Because if so, we want to ask the question, is this necessary? Was this an intentional change, yes or no?
Hmm.
Right? So the idea is really SLIs, some metrics, and then SLOs, your objectives. And what we do with Keptn, we are, as I said, we're looking at a list of SLIs. We're pulling out the metrics. Well, not we, the monitoring tools that we integrated with, whether it's Prometheus or Dynatrace or other tools we can integrate with. We're pulling out the metrics for a time frame, and then we provide two options. You can either compare each of those against a static threshold, where you say, my SLO is 100 milliseconds response time for that service, because that's our objective. Or you can say, I want to compare it relatively to the previous builds. I want to make sure we're not getting slower or worse compared to the previous release or the previous 5 builds. So you can specify this. And Keptn is then looking at all of these results, is evaluating every metric, and then it comes up with an overall score that we normalize between 0 and 100. And this is what you also see up there, I think, in the image, in the screenshot,
Hmm.
where we can say what's the overall score, in this case 87.5%. And then you can configure, again, as part of the Keptn quality gate configuration, what's your percentage that you would consider the overall evaluation to be good, or warning, or failed.
Absolutely. Well, that was a great breakdown, and there's also some great documentation on the site here. You'll see it has links out to the Google SRE book and that sort of thing. So if folks are interested in looking at that a bit more, definitely check out the Quality Gates page here.
Mhm.
So yeah, this makes a lot of sense, because it's super helpful if you can have set rules that say, this is when we go to dev, or this is when we go from dev to staging, or staging to prod, et cetera, right? That are based on actual metrics, as opposed to saying, we've tested this, we think it works pretty well. This is actual hard evidence, right?
Mhm.
And as you said, and we're going to see this in a little bit as well, you can set, maybe from dev to staging. If it passes all of your SLOs, you're going to say, go ahead and move it up to staging, right? Because that's
Yeah.
not as big of a blast radius. But maybe from staging to prod, on the other hand, you might say, gear it up to go to prod, but I want to always provide a manual check and just make sure everything looks good to me.
Exactly.
Um, so yeah, that was a great overview. I appreciate that. As I mentioned before, if folks are interested in, more in-depth tutorials, you can see some of these are quite long, and go into real depth. I definitely recommend checking out this Keptn tutorials page. Before we dive into the demo, and how Crossplane can kind of work with Keptn, I did want to give a little bit of overview for folks who are new. So it's pretty simple what Crossplane does at its base level. Just like Keptn, it kind of extends the Kubernetes control plane. So what we're doing is allowing you to talk to external APIs to provision infrastructure, typically on cloud providers, but could be anything from, creating a Git repo to spinning up a new database. So you can imagine with a tool like Keptn, this can be really valuable if it's, orchestrating different deployments. Not only can you deploy your Helm chart, but you could also, deploy your database. You could deploy your, your Git repo. Like I said, you could go ahead and put all of those through there, and you can actually provision the infrastructure that your service consumes as well. So that's one of the benefits of being standardized on the Kubernetes API. And another benefit is if you're using Keptn, you can write these services to integrate with different things. So you could actually have, for instance, like an AWS service if you wanted to, that you could write for Keptn, because it can kind of trigger any sort of orchestration. But if you plug in Crossplane with it, you just get kind of all of that out of the box, right? You can say, now I have AWS and GCP and whatever cloud provider you like. And then you can just put those objects in your pipeline to go ahead and utilize those different services.
And what another use case, maybe you already thought about this, but besides the delivery use case in Keptn, we also do the remediation use case. So think about it. In a true multi-cloud application, maybe your monitoring tool detects there's a problem with an AWS region, and that then is sent to Keptn, and Keptn can orchestrate the remediation by calling Crossplane and say, hey, let's stand up an environment in GCP or in Azure, and then move the workload over because we have a problem on some other cloud.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because I'm about to talk a little bit about some of the abstractions you can have. And even without changing it from a, once again, sticking with the database case, you could have like your RDS instance. And then it's like, oh, that didn't work. I'll do a Cloud SQL instance. With Crossplane, you can create abstractions in front of that just say, I have a MySQL database, and you just tell me whether you want it on AWS or GCP. So this remediation could get very straightforward. Which would be awesome. So kind of looking at the general workflow for how folks get introduced to Crossplane. First, they usually just start off with just provisioning infrastructure, specific to a cloud provider. So here, creating an RDS instance and configuring it how you like. Crossplane is going to go ahead and create that on AWS, and then write the connection details to a secret. As always, if you have questions about support for different providers for Crossplane, you can go to the documentation site and take a look at all the different CRDs that are there. And these are basically the different things you can provision with Crossplane on a given provider. So feel free to check out that site. And then after folks kind of go through this initial workflow of just spinning up a resource and then deleting it, they'll typically move on to composition. So this is what I was talking about a little bit in terms of creating abstractions, right? So here, instead of actually creating an RDS instance or a Cloud SQL instance, we're going to install a configuration package, which basically says, I'm going to bring along all these different providers, and I'm going to know how to translate these abstract types to these more granular types. And that means that on AWS, you can create a Postgres SQL instance, and on GCP, you can create the same Postgres SQL instance, and all you're changing is a label there about which one you want to go to. So as you were mentioning before, that'd be really easy in remediation, right? Just change this from AWS to GCP, and then you'd be on your way.
It's pretty cool.
Absolutely. So that's kind of the general flow. We are about 35 minutes in, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into the demo. And while we're going through this, Andy, I'll definitely be, doing a few different things to get the demo running. Definitely feel free to jump in and just, talk about anything that's happening behind the scenes. Sure. And we've already had some good use cases that I could see this demo expanding to in the future. But maybe some more will pop up as well while we go through it.
And the more I sip on my wine, the more creative the ideas get.
We were talking before this, and unfortunately it's only 2:30 here in St. Louis, Missouri. So I wasn't quite to the point where I was ready to have a drink, but we might have to start doing the show later on my time to make it a little more enjoyable. But per usual, all of this documentation and these assets are going to be available in the TBS repo. So if folks want to run through this afterwards, feel free to go there. and you can go ahead and run through it yourself. But we're going to start off with some of the instructions I basically just pulled from the Keptn site. And I have a Kubernetes cluster already spun up here, so we can go ahead and look and see. It's a GK cluster, so there is some stuff already in here. But I will go ahead and start walking through this. So like Andy was saying earlier, you don't have to use Istio here. But if you're going to deploy a Helm chart or something like that, which is what we're going to do today, use the kind of generic continuous delivery flow. It does make it super easy if you go ahead and get this installed. And it only takes a moment, so that is super useful. Andy, one thing I did want to ask you, which we talked about before, we'll see in a minute that I've got a pretty straightforward Helm deployment here that I'm going to put into the cluster using Keptn. And so it's just a single deployment and a single service, which is kind of the unit of granular deployment with Helm that y'all support right now. But you mentioned to me that y'all are going to be supporting more complex Helm charts in the future. I didn't know if you had anything you want to say about that.
Yeah, so the reason why with the current version 0.7.3, we only support deployments with a single service is because we are parsing the whole thing. And then remember, we do the blue-green, and we basically go through it and create a blue and green, or canary and primary, as we call it, virtual service. And that was our first implementation. And so we kind of, made it quote unquote easy for us and said, well, our limitation right now is that you can only have one service definition. But with 0.8, which is in alpha already, you will be able to specify any type of Helm chart, whether there's one service, multiple service, whatever is in there can then be used.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. And another thing I want to mention is, like I said, I didn't get to actually get a service written up for this show, but I was looking at the interface y'all have for integrating a service that you've written with Keptn, and it's super straightforward. You mentioned standardization on cloud events, which I don't know how many viewers have ever used cloud events before, but it's basically just a super well-defined API. There's a lot of libraries that go with it. So yeah, I know I think it's in the Keptn contrib org, you'll have a number of services, and you'll see it really doesn't, for instance, here's the Argo service. It really doesn't take much code at all to get something going. So here, I mean, we have a single main file and a package, which basically just, executes some commands to roll stuff out. So you can really easily put something together for your specific use case as well.
There's also, if you do me the favor, in the Keptn sandbox org. So Keptn-sandbox, yeah. If you go there, you also find you see the Keptn service template go. Yeah.
Nice.
Exactly. Perfect. So that's just the easiest way. You just clone it, and then there's an event handlers go, and you just fill in the blanks basically. So that's where you find
awesome
everything. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes it even easier. We've used the same strategy with the different providers, which are kind of, our extension point in Crossplane. And it's nice to just be able to click use this template, right? And it creates the repo already set up for you. All right, so we have Istio installed, I believe. Let's make sure. I don't think it's Istio.
I think Istio system.
Istio system, yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
So it looks like we've got everything there. All right, we should be good to go. Next thing we want to do is go ahead and install Keptn. And I'm going to use this use case continuous delivery. Do you want to, I know you already mentioned it a little bit, but do you want to talk a little bit more about the difference between this use case and any other ones that y'all support?
Yeah, so right now there's two, right? There's, if you leave it out, then it just installs the control plane, which means the core eventing engine. It installs what we call the Lighthouse service for SLI, SLO validation. It installs the bridge, so all the core components. But if you add use case equals continuous delivery, it additionally installs the Helm service, which then allows you to do continuous delivery. And the Helm service requires Istio. This is really what it is right now. Also, the other thing, as you can see here, actually, I mean, the Keptn CLI internally is using a Helm chart. So it downloads the Helm charts for Keptn. That means if you don't want to use the Keptn CLI for the installation on the docs, there's also a section where you can where you can download or get the Helm instructions, the Helm charts for Keptn.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I'm also behind the scenes here. I'm gonna bump the size of my GKE pool.
Yeah, it
'Cause I
seems
have a
that
pretty
you are
small
running
one.
into some resource limitations, huh?
Yep. Let's see. I ran into this a few times when I was deploying things earlier. All right, so it should be
Yeah.
scaling behind the scenes here now.
Perfect. Isn't that the
And
beauty of
should-
Kubernetes?
I know. More
And
compute, please, and you just
well,
get
let's say the beauty of elastic compute, where you just like, give me more money and then
right.
you get whatever you want.
Right. The cloud providers love it too. All right, let's see. Let me make sure that actually updated. Yeah, it's resizing the pool for me here.
Perfect.
All right, so that should come up momentarily.
And while this is running, so because of sizing, where maybe people wonder how many resources does it take? It doesn't take that many, but it depends on, especially for the continuous delivery use case, right? You have to factor in that you obviously not only deploy Keptn, but Keptn will then deploy your apps on that same cluster. And I think one of the questions you had on Slack with me, and hopefully I'm not, answering a question now that you may have later for me, but one of the things, can I answer? I think you know what I'm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For sure.
So right now, if you install Keptn on a Kubernetes cluster, it will then also deploy on that same Kubernetes cluster. And what we also do with 0.8, with the version that I've been mentioning several times now, we are separating the control plane from the execution plane, execution plane now for real, which means you can install Keptn, just the core concepts, the core services on one Kubernetes cluster, and then the individual services that are then actually subscribing to the events and then doing an action on that target Kubernetes cluster, you can install them anywhere, which then really allows you to do cross-cluster deployments and cross-cluster anything, testing, right? I mean, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's one of the things that we really love, from a Crossplane perspective, right? Because we could dynamically spin up those new clusters and then deploy things into them. So that could be super useful. All right. So next thing I'm going to do here is go ahead and port forward the Keptn console. So that's going to make it available locally for me. And let's see. I remember need to authenticate to Keptn here. Let's see. Retrying.
I wonder if the API gateway is already up. Can you double check? Is it up? Yeah.
Yeah. Let me take another look.
Yeah.
Oh. Huh. Well, it looks like I'm having issues connecting to the actual API server. Let me make sure I don't have any issues here on the GKE side. Yeah, it looks like it's having an issue repairing the cluster. All right, looks like it had some problems scaling the node pool, but it should come up here momentarily. Let's make sure that it comes back. All right, still taking some time. We'll go ahead and look ahead in the demo and kind of backfill a little bit. So what all does the API gateway do for you? It's splitting it right between kind of like the control plane and then the UI that you get, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I think in your architecture diagram that you had open earlier in the documentation, it shows it nicely. So it is basically the service that is handling all of the communication to Keptn. And I think here it is exactly. And now you were exposing it through port forward. Now, if you have obviously Istio installed, you can just expose it through Istio via an ingress. That's an option. But basically, yeah, what it provides is access either to the API, to the backend, to the whole eventing system, or to the bridge. We call the UI the bridge, right? Because remember, we are a captain on the ship, and that's like what it is.
I like it.
Exactly. So that's the magic behind the scenes of the API gateway. Yeah, and it also says service types, right? Depending on how you install it, you can either expose it via cluster IP, load balancer, node port, and yeah, depends then on your deployment. I think there's one nice, if you click on release 0.7.3, I really like that visualization. If you click on operate Keptn, the first one, and then you click on install CLI and Keptn, also the first sub menu item. And if you scroll down a little bit, it gives you a nice also visualization a little further. Here we go.
Oh,
right.
Nice.
So here it tells you, what's the best way to expose Keptn to the outside world, either via load balancer, via node port, via an ingress like Istio, or via port forward.
Awesome. Well, that is super useful. It looks like my cluster is getting closer. Let's see here. All right, it's at least taking some time as opposed to immediately erroring. So we should see. I'm not exactly sure what happened with the node scaling, but should come up here momentarily. But basically all we're going to do is go ahead and authenticate so we can communicate with Keptn, and we'll take a look at the UI as well. And then we'll go about onboarding the service that we have here. So I have a simple little Go app, which basically just communicates with a MySQL database behind the scenes. And so in our deployment here, the Helm chart is just going to go ahead and deploy that app and have a init container as well that basically just sets up the table in the MySQL database for us. But in order to do that, we're going to install Crossplane, and we're going to create a configuration package, which is kind of how you install these abstractions. So starting with the crossplane.yaml, we're basically saying we need at least Crossplane v1.0. And then we depend on provider GCP. So folks who haven't used Crossplane in a while, we have two types of packages: the providers, which add these kind of like granular managed resources, which allow you to provision things on the cloud provider. And then the configuration packages, which is what we're authoring here, which say, I'd like to create my own type. So here it's a MySQL instance. And this is the scheme I want for it, just this really simple one where I specify the size. And then I'll have a composition, which behind the scenes is going to map to an actual cloud provider and use some patches to translate that kind of abstract resource to the actual more granular resource. And this is how you can do the scheduling with labels to say, I want this on GCP or AWS, et cetera. Here we're only backing by GCP, but you could easily add provider AWS and add a composition for that as well. So hopefully it looks like it's still having issues here with the cluster. It might be even faster just create a new one. Let's see.
It just shows us that Google is also just a software company that sometimes works perfectly, right?
No kidding.
Yeah.
I haven't had a cluster be down for this long in there we go.
There we go.
It's back. All right. Perfect. And let's make sure, everything in Keptn looks good. So we should be able to authenticate there now.
I think you need to do the
port forward.
Again. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Unless you want to expose it through Istio ingress.
I would, except for that I'm about to print the password to the screen too. In which case I don't want it to be public. Okay. I could open another terminal and do that, but we'll just port forward for now.
That's okay. I almost got you.
All right. So it looks like that we did successfully authenticate. And then what we can do is go ahead and pull up I believe it's on 8080 here. So it's going to pull up Bridge, right? It's going to prompt me for sign in. And so I can use this command here to get the username and password, which I believe users just kept in by default. Exactly. And then it's going to give me this password. But I'm port forwarding and I'm going to delete this afterwards. So it's fine.
And nobody, because you're port forwarding, nobody can get to this anyway.
Right. Exactly.
So you're not getting jailed.
Right. Exactly. We have had passwords exposed on this show before, so you have to scrub those real quick afterwards. But as you'll see here, it's pretty bare right now because we haven't created any projects or services. And that's kind of like the units that you'll be interacting with here in Keptn. So a project is kind of defined by that shipyard that Andy was talking about earlier. And then a service is kind of the unit of deployment that's going to be, passed through the stages of the shipyard. So like I said, we're going to have our Helm chart that is just our simple web app that talks to a MySQL database. And then we will go ahead and install the Crossplane components to be able to back that with an actual MySQL database. But the first thing I want to do is create a project. And I'm just going to call it TBS and use my local Shipyard file. You can also, and Andy, you can talk about this a little more. The recommended way is to hook this up to a Git repo, right? So you don't have local state that you're having to manage and that sort of thing.
Exactly. So Keptn will now create that project, and
Right.
Keptn internally holds a Git repo
Mm-hmm.
in a so-called configuration service, but you can then define an upstream Git, like a GitHub, a Bitbucket, whatever it is. So you actually then see what Keptn internally holds. So Keptn always internally has the report, the configuration set, the Git repo, but then you can specify an upstream Git.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. So we see that we have these 3 environments defined here, and that corresponds directly to what I have in my Shipyard. So I did not go in depth at all in terms of what all you can do with this. So you'll see we're pretty straightforward here, just saying we're going to use a direct deployment strategy. So we're not doing blue green. But I did make use of the approval strategy that Andy was talking about earlier, where I'm saying if it passes dev, which I don't have any restrictions, so it's always going to, if it deploys successfully, we'll go ahead and go to staging. And then if it has a warning, I like this specifically. You can say if it's a warning level issue, then I want it manual, but otherwise automatic. And then in production, I want to always say no matter how good it looks behind the scenes. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and install Crossplane here. So
you still want to onboard the service, right?
That's true. I should go ahead and do that.
Yeah, because then you're good to go and you're done on the Keptn side.
Right. So that's super easy to get that onboarded. And if you're just playing around like I am, it's really nice. You can just reference the local Helm chart as opposed to having to like serve it from a chart repository or something like that. And if I refresh that here, you'll see that my TBS 24 service is here. And it's created, but it hasn't seen any events. So it's not live in the cluster or anything like that. You will see, though, if I get my namespaces, that I now have a namespace for each stage in that Shipyard, right? So TBS dev prod staging. And so what we're going to do here is I'm going to walk through a little bit of the workflow around building a package here. So we have these manifests, which with Crossplane installed, you could go ahead and apply these directly. But when you package it up as a Crossplane package, a configuration package here, you can put this in an OCI image and push it to Docker Hub or the Upbound registry or wherever you want. And you can do things like, make sure you get a version of provider GCP, which is compatible with the schema you're using, and that sort of thing. So let's go ahead and install Crossplane. So first thing I'm going to do is create the Crossplane system namespace. And then we'll install the stable chart, which is v1.0.0 right now. And it should come up shortly. And we can say get pods in the Crossplane system. And you can see here that we have Crossplane and the RBAC manager, which is going to control giving those different providers access to reconcile their resources. And the next thing I want to do is go ahead and package up our configuration composition here and push that up to the Upbound registry. I have a repo set up for it. It's the same as like a Docker registry, just with some extra metadata. So you can push this to whatever OCI compatible registry you have. But we'll go ahead and build our configuration package. And so that was very straightforward. You'll see here that we just package it as a tarball. So a little bit different than you would with a typical Docker image. Instead of loading it into a Docker daemon, we just save it right there on your file system. And then Crossplane is going to know by that X package extension that that's what you want to push up to the registry. And we should see no issues if it goes up successfully. It looks good. And I can also, let me pull it up over here, show it in my registry myself. Let's see if I go to my repositories. So this is just my upbound registry here, and you'll see that it's actually using the same one. It saw that it didn't change at all from this morning. So I pushed this up this morning. If you want to get your own push command, you can do that. You can push up multiple versions, just like a Docker repository. And then once you do that, you can see things actually in the upbound registry. So for instance, let's see if I don't have that one publicly listed, but if I did, you could see it showing up there. All right, so now that it's available, you can go ahead and install it into your cluster. So I'm going to install from that same registry URL we just used. And what we should see here is both that the configuration package gets installed, so we get those abstractions, but also that provider GCP, which backs the abstractions, is going to get installed, and it should be at least version 0.13, since we did specify that. So if we look for our packages, you'll see that it did go ahead and install provider GCP. So it used version 0.15 because that's the latest version that's greater than 0.13. And you'll see that we're waiting for it to get resolved before our package that depends on it gets resolved. And so you'll see provider GCP is now resolved. And then shortly, you'll also see that the configuration package, which I called Keptn app infra, will get resolved as well. And if we look at the CRDs in our cluster here, we can see that we should have a number of resources now that we can provision on provider GCP, which will then create actual resources in our cloud provider account. And let me make sure that that abstraction came up. So it's not healthy. It probably will take it a minute here. Let's say describe, make sure nothing's wrong behind the scenes. All right. Health is unknown is unhealthy. And let me look at my configuration revisions and make sure nothing. Okay, so it looks like it's healthy now. It just took it a little bit to come up. Looks good. All right, so they're both healthy. So now we can create instances of this abstraction. So I have a couple of different ones here, basically one for each namespace. These are all going to be satisfied by GCP here. So these are going to look identical, except for that they're dev, prod, and staging. So I'll go ahead and deploy those. And as soon as I do that, from a developer perspective, or from an orchestration perspective like Keptn, I'm just creating a MySQL instance. I'm kind of agnostic to what provides it, which in this case is going to be Cloud SQL. But that's not a huge concern to me. So I'll go ahead and apply a bunch of these. And we should see that behind the scenes, we have our MySQL instances, of course, that we just created, which are going to take a few minutes to come up. Oops. Let's see. Unknown file. Okay. There we go. And so you'll see it's not ready yet, but behind the scenes, it's actually creating Cloud SQL instances in this case, because we specified that. So you can see that those are still coming up. And I actually skipped a step here, which is why you're seeing that these are false synced. We have to give provider GCP credentials to be able to talk to GCP, of course. And so let me go back a step here. Basically, I have a JSON IAM file here for GCP. So I'm going to create a secret from that and then a provider config to point at that, which is basically going to allow provider GCP to be able to authenticate. And as soon as it has that, the next time it comes through on a reconcile of those Cloud SQL instances, we'll start to see them turn from false to true. And it'll actually start provisioning those. So yeah, you can see them coming up now. So that one's true, but it's not ready yet because it takes a little bit of time. And now we can actually go about provisioning our service because it's going to have a database to talk to behind the scenes. And there's a number of different ways you can trigger things going through a Keptn pipeline, right? And I'm just going to use this kind of like send event command. Do you want to talk about kind of like the different ways that a stage of a pipeline might get kicked off?
Yeah. So when essentially everything is event driven. So you always say, Keptn, I have an event for you, and you send an event. An event is always a cloud event. Remember, we talked about this earlier. Mm-hmm. It's a well-defined, protocol, and it's JSON basically. And the event that triggers a Keptn delivery pipeline end to end is a so-called configuration change event. So I'm basically telling Keptn, I have a new configuration for you. And for the delivery use case, the configuration change is normally hey, I have a new artifact for you. That's why we called the CLI comment, Keptn send event, new artifact. And then you say for which project, for which service, for which stage. If you omit the stage, it will obviously take the first stage in your Shipyard file, which in your case is def. So behind the scenes, that CLI comment is sending a configuration change event for the first stage. And you could do it another way too. We have an API that allows you to send that event. So it's up to you in the end how you interact and how you trigger Keptn. But the CLI is a nice way to Keptn new event, new artifact, and yeah,
for sure. And we can also see those Cloud SQL instances there. They're still pending create. But if I hop over here on my other screen and let me see, looks like everything is good. So they should be up soon. So it's provision these actual on GCP. And then it's going to write secrets to each of the namespaces that is going to be used to connect to the database. So you can see they're not there yet because they're still waiting on creation. But once it comes up, the secret name that we specified, which I believe is dbcon for all of these, is going to be available. And then when we deploy our chart here, our pods are going to use those secrets to be able to get the keys, to be able to talk to the database and go ahead and provision it and have an API for it. So hopefully those don't take too much longer to come up.
Well, in the meantime, while we're waiting for this, I think we have a couple of use cases identified that we want to use to integrate Keptn closer, right? And I think I really like the obviously on-demand creating environments, let's say for a testing stage. I think that's pretty cool. But the other one is really nice too with the auto remediation. Hey, there is a problem and a Crossplane, I need you to spin up an environment that we need because we have either excessive load and this is causing a problem. We have an outage somewhere and therefore we need a new environment. So really, really cool integration scenarios and not just integration scenarios that we as tech freaks love to implement, but obviously benefits for users out there, hopefully.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. I'm definitely, after this demo, I'm going to take a deeper look at how we can integrate some of those, and also some of the benefits coming up with the new release of Keptn should facilitate some of that as well. So super exciting to see some of that coming. So we can see here that some of our databases are ready. It looks like almost all of them, they all are now. So I'm going to take a look at the secrets. You'll see we have this DB connection here, and it has 4 connection strings in it, which is going to, well, if we look at our composition, you can see what they map from. So basically port, username, password, endpoint, etc. And in our actual app, it's going to use those to, log in and talk to the database. All right, so what we want to do now is go ahead and actually have our application deployed into our environments. So I'm going to send, as Andy mentioned earlier, I'm going to send a cloud event here and specify the image that I want this Helm chart to be deployed with. All right, and it's going to kick off that pipeline. And if we look over in the UI, we can get a pretty cool view of this. Let me refresh real quick. So we have configuration changed here, and pretty shortly we should see also the stages that are going to come, and it's going to show us some nice charts and stuff, even though we're not really even evaluating SLOs and stuff. Here you see that it's all green, right? Because we didn't specify any gates or anything like that. But you can see how this would be super useful if you had some of them and you can make a decision on whether you wanted to move forward, etc.
And also, if you click on the top, maybe if you scroll all the way to the top, you see the little laptop icon in the configuration change. This is actually the cloud event that is sent,
nice.
Right? That's exactly when you did the Keptn send event new artifact, it was basically sending that event. And this is, for me, it's always great in the Keptn's bridge to see which events are actually sent because you see it everywhere.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, you can see it on all of these. And if you were writing a service, to integrate, this would be super useful because you could get an idea of the types of events that are going to come out for different
Exactly.
applications.
Exactly.
Awesome. All right. So we saw that approval has finished for staging. So it is going to actually already has gone through staging because we said, as even if there's or basically automatically move forward if there's no issues. And then in prod, though, we said always let us choose, right? So you'll see it's waiting for us to go ahead and choose. And I'm sure this probably sends a cloud event as well when I click that. But before we do that, I do want to check out our different namespaces. So let's look. We should have pods in TBS dev and TBS staging, but not in prod yet, right? Because we haven't approved that one to go through. And then we can also see that we have our service. Oops, that is not how you type that. Oh, that's TBS prod still. All right, so there we see we have our cluster IP service, and we can actually go ahead and port forward that as well if we'd like. So let's see, this is TBS prod. So I'm going to go ahead and push this along. So I'll say, go ahead and move on to prod. And we should see here shortly that we have a service in TBS prod. So there it is. And let's make sure that our application is up as well. So it's initializing. And the fact that these are running, actually, just because I have context on the application, lets us know that it was successfully able to talk to the database. In fact, let's just look at the logs and it should say something about that. But that could be another case, right? With an application not being able to talk to a database where you may need some remediation. So that would be a case to evaluate as well. And I'm going to go ahead and port forward this and make sure that we're getting some information coming in. So I'll do to 3000 since we're always using 8080 for the other. And let's just make sure we get our information. So it looks like we are able to access our app. It's very beautifully styled. You can see I'm very much a front-end design person. So
well, but it's bug-free. It's bug-free.
Yeah, it is bug-free, right? It's not even HTML. It's straight text. And so we can also try, and let me pull this off another show I did here. And we can post some information and make sure it goes to the database. All right, so this one is Crossplane and Keptn, and we'll say Dan and Andy, and that's definitely the number of viewers I see on the screen right now, so that should be accurate. And we'll do it to this create endpoint, which should send it on to the database for us. So I'll jump up here. All right, and it looks like it did. And I don't remember actually the exact endpoint to list these, but actually let me jump over and make sure I get it right. List would be a good one for it. All right, and we should see now that we have our data in there. So we are able to talk to the database. We have this very functional web application that is going to solve lots of business problems for us. But we have gone through and shown how you can kind of integrate with Keptn and the benefits of using Crossplane alongside it, and identified some places in the future that we can have further integration. So if you're someone who wants to contribute to a project, whether it be Keptn or Crossplane, and bring some of this collaboration together, that could be a super valuable use case. I think Andy's identified probably the most valuable one. If you want to work on that remediation case, we'd definitely be happy to support you in that. And I'll be looking into it as well. But yeah, I think this was a successful demo. It's always good when you get through it when it's live. But yeah, did you have anything else you wanted to cover today before we wind it down?
No, just really thank you for taking a look at Keptn and encouraging people out there to look at tools like Crossplane, like Keptn. And if people are interested, the beauty of open source is that you can, make things better yourself. Don't just sit there and wait for somebody else to do it. Just do it yourself, right? And yeah, that's it.
Absolutely. Well, we really appreciate you joining the show. It's always definitely a huge privilege for me to get to have amazing guests like yourself on. And as more releases of Keptn come out and Crossplane as well, I'd love to have you back again in the future, and we can explore some more of those use cases.
Sounds good.
Awesome. All
Now
right.
I need
Well,
some auto remediation for my glass of wine, which turned to be empty. Let's see if Keptn can help me, or I just walk over.
yeah, we need to write a service for that. If anyone wants to contribute that one, we'll accept it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Andy, I hope you have a good rest of your day. And for all the folks who tuned in, we appreciate it. And anyone watching this later, definitely feel free to reach out with questions or comments.
Mm-hmm.
All right.